All right. So it's very important that you understand that as clinicians, we are bound by an ethical code and we are bound by legal considerations. When we say an ethical code, almost every professional association has an ethics code. For psychologists, we have something called the APA Ethics Code. And the APA Ethics Code was adopted and amended several times over, but largely we're operating based on the APA Ethics Code of 2002 with some text revisions in 2010 and 2017. And we actually are expecting another revision shortly. But in the APA Ethics Code, that will govern everything we do in terms of professional practice. It addresses how we handle disputes. It addresses issues such as conflict of interest, power differentials, coercion issues. It addresses psychological assessment, teaching, and even psychotherapy. And the ethical standard that is most important for us are standard 10, which has to do with therapy. However, just because we have the APA ethics code doesn't mean that we're not bound by other ethics code. For example, the American Group Psychotherapy Association has an ethics code specifically for group therapy or group counseling. And there are specialty documents that further elucidate the APA ethics code. And that's what I want to impress upon you. If you only know the APA ethics code, you are probably not going to have the nuance that you need. So I encourage you to look at specialty documents as well from the American Psychological Association or other professional associations that are designated to address the unique issues. And in this case, the American Group Psychotherapy Association is one of the major ones. So that's just ethical code, right and wrong, judgment calls. And not everything in the ethics code is black and white. There's a lot of gray area. There are only a few areas that are absolute. For example, you do not engage in a romantic relationship with a client. Clear, right? That's black and white. Now, a former client, also clear, right? There are guidelines about what happens if you meet a former client and you hit it off. Well, I don't recommend it because you know too much about the person and you've seen them in a different way. I still don't recommend it. But the American Psychological Association says there's a 2-year moratorium. And you can't just stop seeing your client because you want to date them. It just has to take its course naturally. But notice how clear that is. It's very, very specific. Now, why do we need that? The answer is also simple because in the history of psychology, there are many people who abuse their power. When you put on a white lab coat or you call yourself doctor, that comes with power. And there's a power differential that people like Carl Jung and many other psychologists of yesteryear used and took advantage of their power, and they actually had romantic relationships with their clients. No bueno, right? So that is very clear. but most things are gray areas in the ethics code. Which brings me to the legal issue. So we talked about ethics and ethical codes. Now, when I use the word legal, we're talking about the law. The law is a lot more concrete than ethics code. Now, granted, we wouldn't have cases going to an appellate division or the Supreme Court if every aspect of law was clear. There is still nuance in law, but law is a lot more clear. And if you go to standard 1 of the APA ethics code, they say that if you have a debate between your ethics code and the law, you follow the law. Now, if the ethics code is a little more stringent than the law, you might still benefit from following your ethics code. But if the law is more stringent than your ethics code, then you certainly follow the law. So these are, I'm just trying to give you a flavor between the difference between ethics and legal statutes. So, all right, let us begin with some learning objectives. So we'll talk about basic or major ethical issues related to group membership, the concept of informed consent, the aspect of psychological risks when being in a group, the importance of confidentiality and the role of confidentiality in groups, the role of the leader, right, in terms of their value system in group work. How do you handle conflict in value systems? Earlier in our group, we talked about there is no right or wrong, right? Each person can have their difference of opinion, difference in values, difference in perspective, and that's okay most of the time. So there are ethical ways to handle conflict in values. All right. You also want to explore ethical issues surrounding diversity, equity, and inclusion. You want to address social justice in your groups. You want to address ethical issues related to sexual orientation in groups. And just to give you another example, there are guidelines with working with individuals who are part of the LGBTQ plus community. So we have guidelines that go beyond the basic ethics code, talking about ethical issues related to group techniques and competency and training and being culturally appropriate and relevant. We want to talk about ways that students can get direct experience by participating as members of a small group activity. For example, because this is a graduate level class, you have that experiential piece. Every week, we have a group process. That is not without ethical dilemmas. Being your professor, as well as being a contributor to the group, that is a dual relationship. Now, that doesn't mean it is forbidden. Not every dual relationship is forbidden, but there are some concerns about what you will share and what you won't share with your professor, right? You want to talk about how training and the effective training of group counselors. Every week, you'll see me jump in or demonstrate another activity. For example, today you saw me highlighting the getting to core beliefs and cognitive restructuring. So you saw that today. And each week you might learn another skill. You also have to think about legal liability and malpractice and any safeguards when practicing group therapy. So that is the lay of the land. Now, I already started to talk about this. Ethical issues pertain to standards of conduct for professional members. The APA Ethics Code does not regulate my personal life, but it does regulate my professional identity as an instructor, as a professor, and as a clinical psychologist, and as a researcher. So I am bound by these standards. And each professional organization has its own organizations and professional standards that are important to it. So I mentioned the American Psychological Association, but we're not the only one who has an ethics code. The American Counseling Association has one. The National Association for School Psychologists has another one, and it goes on and on and on. Now, I do want to distinguish between ethical principles and ethical standards. You keep hearing me say standard 1, standard 10, which are like mini chapters of the ethics code. Well, ethical principles are more on the ideal level, whereas ethical standards are enforceable. You can lose your license for violating an ethical standard. Ethical principles, right? In the APA Ethics Code, there are 5 ethical principles. There are 10 enforceable standards, and each of the standards are general categories of how we practice. Now, when it comes to legal issues, these are the minimum standards that a given society will tolerate, or what we call the rule of law. And that is also pretty complex because you have the federal law, state law, and your local municipality laws. And I'll give you an example. When we think about coronavirus, right? And traveling during the pandemic, each state will put out a guidance for its state. That guidance is not a law-based document. It's a recommendation. Whereas if the governor issues an executive order, that is the law, and you have to abide by it. And you can have criminal and civil penalties for violating the law or executive orders. The Center for Disease Control provides standards as well, but they're recommendations. The law is what comes out of the executive chamber or the legislative chamber of a given government. Now, what's tricky is that we talked about the local or municipal level, the state level, and the federal level. And there is a hierarchy. In general, the Constitution prevails. So the state law cannot contradict the federal law. And if it does, the federal law gets precedent. Now, we have issues, right? There was a debate whether President Biden was going to issue a mask mandate on a federal level. And in the end, they didn't do that. It wasn't a mandate, which means that the states are allowed to determine whether or not masks are required or optional. And each state handled it differently, as you've seen. Now, so far, I've talked to you about basic principles of law in coronavirus, but nothing happens in a vacuum. Coronavirus affects psychologists. So there are both legal and ethical issues with practice during the COVID pandemic. Should we keep our doors open? Should we have face-to-face therapy? Should we go virtual? Do we need the patient's consent whenever you switch modality? All of these questions are related to ethical concerns that stem out of a larger legal issue. And sure enough, there are malpractice companies like the APA Trust, the Insurance Trust, and the American Professional Agency that offer guidance on how to close a practice, how to reopen a practice, and when you switch modality, how to do it. It's interesting, right? So here we are, we're talking about this larger issue, but it affects how we teach. It affects how we provide therapy, and there are additional ethical issues that emerge out of legal issues. But the law is the basic minimum standard that we're willing to accept. All right. We talk about clinical issues. So clinical issues are related to your judgment. These are issues related to professional judgment. And one of the number one reasons, one of the top reasons, better yet, how a person gets in trouble with a licensure board is demonstrating poor judgment. You can temporarily lose your license. You can be sanctioned for demonstrating poor judgment, right? And you're like, well, this was a clinical issue. In my best clinical judgment, I decided X. And if an objective body decides X was wrong, now you have a problem because your actions are outside of the ethical and legal mandates of your professional community. So you have to be very careful. And then we have cultural issues that relate. And I know our first session, I did the whole cultural identity model to help us understand culture from a more multi-dimensional level, but it includes and is not limited to your ethnicity, gender, religion, sexual orientation, your values, and so forth. Understanding cultural issues. And I will tell you, knowing your value system and knowing your cultural identity is important because you bring you into the room. I also had you discover your primary and your secondary theoretical orientation, because that's going to help you know how you're going to best lead a group. Today's group would have been best described as a cognitive behavioral intervention or a cognitive behavioral led group. Last session's group was more of an, it had a behavioral component, but it was more of a humanistic / existential bend, if you ask me, right? So knowing your value system is going to be also important because you bring yourself into the room. It also creates the potential for bias. And everybody has biases, and they could be minimal. They got minimal effect in your treatment, or they could have significant impact on your treatment. So that's why we have these guidances about understanding cultural issues as well. So, informed consent. Many of you have heard of the term informed consent, but you probably have heard of informed consent in the context of research. And I'm going to break this down the way I do as if I were teaching a research course. When I think of the word informed consent, it's a compound noun. So both are important. Consent is important. That is to say, you need to have the ability to agree to participate, but consent is not enough. It needs to be an informed consent. And when we use the word informed consent, You need to know all the important details before you agree to any process. So in research, we usually have the consent form that talks about the risks, talks about the benefits, talks about any compensation, talks about if there's an adverse outcome, who to reach. It provides all the details, all the relevant information to make a sound decision. That is informed consent. Now, it's the same thing for therapy. In order to provide psychotherapy, whether it be individual, couples, family, group, and so forth, your clients must sign a consent form, consent for treatment. And when it comes to group therapy, if you want to do an informed consent for group therapy, you have to tell them the nature of the group, the general goals of the group, the structure of the session, what's expected of them, what they can expect from you as a leader. Now, before I move to the next slide, notice how we talked about the pre-group meeting earlier in the semester. Or if you don't do a pre-group meeting, that first session of group therapy should be all about the rules of group. And if a person wants to participate, they have to sign. Does that make sense? Does anyone have any questions on that, or shall I move forward? All right. So now let's talk about involuntary membership. When you think about going to therapy, most people say, oh, I'm struggling with an issue. I'm going to sign up for therapy and get it treated. But there are some communities where your membership in a group is involuntary. What might that look like? If you are in an inpatient hospital, so if you've been hospitalized, it is possible that one of the requirements for treatment could be group therapy. In order to be discharged, you need to develop a series of skills. If you were sent, if a person was diagnosed with an eating disorder and they were sent away, they might have, as part of their treatment plan, mandatory group therapy. If you are in a forensic setting, such as the Department of Corrections, you might be required to engage in group therapy. Now, all of these are mandated through the court, typically, right? So the person is told by the court, you are a danger to yourself or other people, or you've demonstrated criminal activity, and therefore you no longer can make decisions on your own behalf. So we're going to make decisions for you. So if a person is in an inpatient hospital due to severe and persistent mental illness, such as schizophrenia, they might not be able to make decisions on their own. So a judge might order them to stay in the hospital and receive certain forms of treatment. If a person had an eating disorder to the point where they were painfully thin, or they were going to cause self-harm due to anorexia, they might get a court order to say that you're a harm to yourself. So you must go to some eating disorders clinic, and it might include group therapy. And the same thing in prisons or correctional facilities, a judge will order certain things. In the case of divorce, you might have involuntary membership. So if the person is engaging in intimate partner violence and it goes before the judge could order anger management sessions, right? So there are many examples, and these are not the only examples where a person could be involuntarily forced into a group. Now, when that happens, it oftentimes starts with a whole lot of resentment from the member. person doesn't want to be there. They feel like you're forcing them to do something they don't want to do. So one of the first things that you need to do is try and demonstrate how that even though this was a mandate, it's still in their best interest. It's still beneficial to them. So that is going to be crucial. So if you can highlight that even though this is involuntary, they could personally benefit from the group, they're going to be more likely to come on board and actually benefit from the group. Now, even when it's involuntary, though, you still should go over the rules of group, the information about the group, and still get the buy-in of the members as much as possible. So that's very important to understand that. You also want to avoid coming in with preconceived notions or preconceived biases, such as because they're involuntary, they don't want to change. People might want to change, but people also may not want to be told what to do. So I've seen tremendous growth in mandated clients before. It happens. If you work in an outpatient clinic or an inpatient hospital, at one time or another, you're going to have someone come in because they were ordered by the court, and you're going to see it. So you want to treat them with the same respect and dignity as if they started with voluntary decision making. Another example of group membership, which may be somewhat involuntary, is when you're working with young children. They are subjected to whatever their parents or guardians say. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't get parental consent and the child's assent. Still, you want to get the buy-in of the child. So these are just a few examples of how, even in the case of involuntary membership, you want to show respect and dignity. Now, one of the rules is that everybody, unless it's a mandatory group, has the right to leave group if they don't feel that it's working for them. And a standard recommendation is to try 3 sessions. Maybe it's not the right fit. Maybe the clinician isn't, you don't connect with the clinician. Maybe the group dynamics are such that you don't feel that it works for you. But if you choose to leave group, one of the expectations is that you should explain to the rest of the group why you're leaving group. And if this is your expectation of a group member, you as group leader have to set the guidelines from the first session. Say, hey, here are my procedures if you want to leave group. But it's still your right to leave. But it's very important so that people don't feel abandoned, people don't feel like someone's missing, or people can write their own narratives if someone just disappears from a group. So it's very important to inform the leader and the members before making a final decision. Now, what happens if you waited the 3 weeks, you're not feeling the group, you tell the group leader and you tell the group members that, yeah, this group isn't for me, and then people start to put pressure on you. Oh no, give it more time, give it more time. It is the group leader's responsibility to block that, to shield you from any undue pressure to stay in the group. Now, in terms of participating in a group, if you choose to stay in the group, there's a whole host of considerations that could occur, right? So one issue is the misuse of power, right? So a group leader can abuse power. Members of the group can abuse power. There are a bunch of factors related to abusing power. Self-disclosure. once you say something, you don't have control over that which was said. So once something is out, it's out. Now, ideally, one should maintain your confidence. One should keep whatever you said protected. But confidentiality is, even though it's an expectation, people don't always keep confidentiality. Scapegoating, you have the potential risk of one member of the group being blamed or used as the excuse for why the group is not functioning, or one person being targeted over the others. And then confrontation. Now, earlier in the semester, I gave you 5 rules when doing a healthy and appropriate confrontation. But if confrontation is not done well, it could cause significant psychological risk to members of the group. Okay, now, confidentiality is absolutely a foundation for all working groups. If the group is not, if they don't feel that what they say is going to be held in confidence, you're never going to get to working stage. And we talked about the initial stage is all about developing rapport and determining whether the environment is safe. Then we talked about the transitional stage, where you're putting your toe in the water, testing the leader, testing other members of the group. There's some conflict involved there. But if during those first 2 stages and things emerge, if things emerge that you put yourself in a vulnerable position, it's still the responsibility of the group members to keep your confidence. Because if that doesn't happen, you're never going to get away from the superficial. Now, not everything that is said in group can stay in group. There's the basic Tarasov principle. Now, I'm not sure if you know the story of Tatiana Tarasov, but this changed how we view confidentiality. Well, there was a student in California who was in the university counseling center, and he stated that he had intent to cause harm to Tatiana Tarasov. The therapist told the university police, but never told the prospective victim in the case of Tatiana Tarasov. In the end, he wound up killing Tatiana Tarasov. And from that experience, Tarasov's family sued the university, sued the police, the police involved, and they won. And they found that the clinician did not do enough to protect the safety of others. So there are examples when confidentiality cannot be maintained. If you are a harm to yourself or others, if you're suicidal or homicidal, and you have intent, plans, and mean to cause harm to yourself or other people, we are required to breach confidentiality. But we're also required to tell you that. So when I talk about the concept of suicide, I tell my clients, I have to love you even when you feel that you're unlovable. And I really love all of my clients. I care about them deeply. So even when they're in the depth of depression and they feel hopeless and helpless, I have to care about them and protect them from self-harm if there's imminent harm. If there's imminent harm to other people, I have to take every action necessary to protect that person. For example, in the Tarasov case, the mistake was not to tell Tarasov that she was in jeopardy. You would breach confidentiality if there's a harm to another person. Now, notice how this is a lecture, but it there are rules. Now, I used some words. Imminent harm. Imminent harm also has a meaning. That means that there is a real and likely threat in the future to a person or other people around them. What if a person tells you that in the past they engaged in homicide? Let's say you're working in a prison setting and you're working for the Department of Corrections, and a person is there for whatever reason, I don't know, let's say drug sales. And during the process of being mandated to group therapy, they tell you that they also engage in homicide as part of a gang initiation. Are you required to tell law enforcement that they engaged in murder of another person? The answer is no, because the crime has already taken place and the likelihood of reoffending at that point in time is limited. So you, as a clinician, are not required to report that because there's no imminent harm, which is interesting. Here we are talking about maybe on a moral level, you feel guilty that, hey, you have this, privilege information and it's on your conscience, but from an ethical point of view, you're not required to. Now, if there are in your contract, if there is in your contract something, or in the state constitution, something that requires you to share, that's different. But assuming there's not, there is client-therapist privilege. And without a court order to testify, you don't have to voluntarily disclose that. So confidentiality is a very fascinating thing. Now, we need to talk about the importance of confidentiality. We also need to talk about the consequences of breaching confidentiality. So a common example of breaching confidentiality is subgrouping, where you talk to other members of the group outside of the group about some of the discussions within the group. Well, that is really breaching the confidence of the group. A simple consequence of doing that might be that you might be required to tell the group the next session that you engage in subgrouping, right? So that would be one consequence of breaching confidentiality. If it is on an ongoing basis a few times, you might put in the contract, the informed consent form, that you will terminate a person from group for ongoing breach of confidentiality. Now, these are the basic rules, but we also want to impress upon group members why confidentiality is important. It protects them, it protects their other members of the group, and it allows us to get to an honest level. So if you are not sure, there are different considerations that you have to think about. So social media is a very good example. If I am a psychologist, I have a dilemma every time a student or a client friend requests me. And I have a general rule: I do not accept friend requests from clients or students. Former students, I do accept friend requests. It's not an issue at that point. The potential boundary is no longer an issue. And things like LinkedIn, I have tons of St. Francis students or former students who friend request me on LinkedIn. So these are the kind of things that you have to be careful with, because what happens if you have a client in your group friend request you and you accept them as a friend, and then they post on your wall on Facebook about something? Now there's a problem, right? Because you might have to address an issue of privacy and confidentiality because of that posting. Or you might be able to peer into their life in a way that is coercive, where you're seeing things about them that they didn't bring up in the treatment room that you're seeing on their social media. So social media presence and confidentiality is tricky. So in general, I strongly advise you against accepting your clients on your social media. It's not advisable. Now, everybody has a digital fingerprint, everybody has a social media presence, even whether you think you don't. Because if you have LinkedIn or you're on ResearchGate, if you're a professor like me, this is social media. You may not think of ResearchGate as social media, but it is. So everybody has some level of digital fingerprint. Everybody has some level of social media presence. So you want to think about what you put out there. The general rule I also tell students is, when in doubt, don't press send. Because if you press send and you put it on social media, you can't undo it. And then obviously we talked about ethical and legal dimensions of confidentiality. You can breach confidentiality for a court order. Now, there is a difference between a subpoena and a court order. A subpoena comes from a lawyer, and you can file for a certificate of confidentiality to block a subpoena. A court order, there's nothing you could do to block it. Now, multicultural dimensions of confidentiality, different cultures are going to be more guarded than others. Different cultures are going to be more forthcoming than others. And then you have to be careful not to create vulnerability based on that. As it relates to minors, that's also important to protect confidentiality. So you remember how I talked about a child maybe being involuntarily put in a group by a parent? Just because the parent put them in a group does not mean they have access to what that kid said. It becomes privileged. And there are many times when I've had to tell a parent, if you want to know what Johnny said, you should ask Johnny. I'm not going to tell you. But you're billing my insurance. I understand, but there is client therapist privilege. But I pay you out of pocket. I understand, and I appreciate the fact that you're investing in therapy, but I cannot breach their confidence. If it's something that is necessary for you to know, I would tell you. But anything other than that, I'm not going to. Because minors may have problems with their parents that they want to talk about, or their guardians that they want to talk about. And if they felt that the therapist was going to share what they said in group or individual therapy, they're not going to share with you, because all of a sudden the parents or guardians can weaponize that against them. All right. So in terms of the leader, the role of the leader's values in a group, you need to understand your value system, because your value systems affect how you think, how you behave, your emotional reactions to what other people say. So your thoughts, emotions, and behaviors are all affected by your value system. Now, it's very, very important that you don't superimpose your value system on other people. And I've seen this often with religion. I wear a yarmulke. I'm Orthodox Jewish, and that comes with a certain set of values. I don't require my clients to subscribe to Judaism in order for me to work with them, which means that invariably I'm coming with cultural values that could potentially clash. So you have to be aware of that. And if you're having a certain emotional reaction, maybe it's because of a values clash. Don't superimpose your values. I'll share a story with you. I remember I was teaching abnormal psychology. This is now about a decade ago. And I wear a yarmulke. And occasionally I get other Orthodox Jewish students who take my classes. And we were talking about what is considered abnormal. And we were going through the Ronald Kammer, the principles of the 4Ds of what's considered normal and abnormal, right? Deviance, distress, dysfunction, and sometimes danger. And I used the example of homosexuality as an example of something that would not be considered a psychological disorder. And I ran it through the 4Ds. And I remember, and I think it's good on the person to be able to say this to me, but I needed to clap back. So a student, she raised her hand and she's like, I don't understand. How could you be Orthodox and work with LGBT community? And it goes back to that bullet point. It is not your job to superimpose your value system on other people. So I said, if I wanted to judge people, I would have went to law school. My job is not to judge people, not to superimpose values on other people. My job is to help you identify your value system and help you live the most authentic life you can live. And if that means your values don't align with mine, that's okay, as long as you're living the most authentic and meaningful life you can live. And some of the greatest work I've done is with members of the LGBT community. And guess what? The first thing they did, and I remember in initial intake, is oftentimes they'll look at the yarmulke. And then I have to explain what allyship is and how I'm an ally and all of that jazz. And we're not here for theology, we're here for therapy, right? So all of these things, but it's important. People come in with their biases, and in therapy, you're meant to set your values to the side and help people live in accordance with their values as much as possible. Doesn't mean there isn't leakage or spillage or whatever you want to say where it comes into the room. It does happen, but you want to check yourself a little bit when working with people. Now, you want to help people live in accordance, as I said, with their value system or the members' worldview, not yours. So one of your jobs is to help people clarify their own value system. Believe it or not, many people don't know their value system. What do you stand for, right? And, if I were to ask you what your purpose in life is, most of you probably couldn't answer the question because you're still figuring it out. So one of the roles of the leader is to help you identify your goals and values and make appropriate decisions. Now, I said to you that there are guidelines. There are many different guidelines. The American Psychological Association has its own code of ethics. But one of the things that's really cool about the American Counseling Association is that they talk about ethical dilemmas and competing value system explicitly in their code of ethics. So you want to certainly explore any conflict of values you have. If there's anything that is interfering with your objectivity, that's your problem as the leader, and it's your job to seek consultation or supervision as much as possible. And you want to engage in ethical bracketing, which is to create a framework around what values you're looking for outside of your own. So you're going to contain the therapeutic experience separate from your own personal worldview. All right. Now, talking about diversity or addressing diversity in group counseling, it is naive to treat the group as a homogeneous bunch, even if the target variable that you're working on, everyone's homogeneous on that. They're not going to be homogeneous on everything. So if you don't address diversity in your group counseling experience, you run the risk of causing harm to members of the group through the experiences of microaggressions, or more specifically, microinvalidations. You could potentially negate a person's existence by not addressing the nuances. So it's your job to bring a multicultural approach to assessment, diagnosis, and treatment with your group, and ignoring the subtle differences among your group members is problematic. All right. So we also have an awareness of the group norms and cultural norms. They don't always align. So one of the cultural norms for individuals from East Asian countries is to be more reserved, to share less frequently or less spontaneously unless they're called upon. So if you run a group therapy experience in a westernized nation, you might have an expectation that people are going to spontaneously talk. And that may not fit with some individuals who come from East Asian cultures. And it's your job as a leader to know when to call upon people, even if it makes them uncomfortable, and when to leave people alone and not call upon them. But you certainly don't want to be like, okay, so-and-so, I want to hear from you. I want to hear from you over and over and over. In our class, you'll notice that I pay attention to who hasn't spoken and make sure that everyone can lend their voice to a topic, right? But you don't want to tread on another person's cultural norms either. Now, in terms of social justice issues, look, your group is simply a microcosm of society. So whatever ails society as a whole is going to show up in your group therapy room. So issues of power and privilege, discrimination and oppression, as much as you try and frame the group a certain way, they're going to show up. For example, power. By definition of having a group leader, they are in a position of power over the client. So there's issues of power. And you might, if you have a member of your group who has had experiences of abuses of power, let's say with law enforcement, you could easily become a symbol of what society was. So you could be the bad parent, or you could be a symbol of law enforcement and abuses that individual might have experienced with law enforcement, and they might come to resent you because you represent authority or you represent power. So you have to pay attention to that. What is a person's experience? Privilege. I walk through life with tremendous privilege. I didn't earn this. It was given to me by society based on my skin color, based on my gender, based on a whole host of factors. So, but nevertheless, I know that I get unfair advantage in certain ways just by being white. And I'm not trying to be overly controversial about that, but white individuals are not treated the same in society as non-whites. Just look at social psychology and you'll see a whole bunch of research on things like shopping while Black, issues of the Asian superiority myth, right? Or the model minority myth, right? Things like that, which really create discord between ethnic groups. Discrimination's overt and oppression, right? When there was the issue related to the travel ban, right? The travel ban in 2017. and I was working with non-US citizens, you better believe that that issue of the travel ban came up in therapy. Over the summer, when there were the issues with the murder of George Floyd, you better believe that came into the treatment room for my clients of color. It comes in because what's happening in the outside world is brought into the room. And it's your job to address issues of social justice. And I'm not saying to do it in an inappropriate way, but it is your job to make sure that you address issues of equity, diversity, inclusion, social justice, because in a multicultural society that we live in, there are always going to be groups that are marginalized or oppressed. And this invites, it's not enough to invite a person to the party. You must also ask them to dance. What do I mean by that? You have to bring these into the room so that people can discuss it and really think about it and address it. So bringing issues of disempowerment, sexism, classism, racism, any ism, you can bring into the room, because if it's affecting your clients or if it's affecting members of your group, then it's worthy to talk about. Sexual orientation, right? So members of the LGBT community have experienced oppression at incredible levels. Not just historically, we're not going to, what was it, this Stonewall Inn, not just there, but even today, the hate crimes towards members of the LGBT community are very high. And it's very important to know that. Homicides towards the trans community has spiked in the last 4 years. What's that all about, right? So, and I'm aware that when we talk about sexual orientation, we're oftentimes talking about the LGB of the LGBT abbreviation, but nevertheless, there's oppression there too. Now, we have history of victimization, abandonment issues. Now, if you are religious and you struggle with working with members of the LGBT community, seek supervision or consultation. And if you can't do the job, refer out. Because I can't tell you how many times people engage in something called conversion therapy. Well, I don't know why it's called therapy. It's not actually, it doesn't work. But there are religious leaders who try and cure you from being gay or lesbian or bisexual, right? Through a really harmful, abusive, and aversive tactics. But it doesn't work. But you might have someone who's religiously devout who might try and encourage such a thing. I'm going to tell you that I'm proud that New York signed into law in 2017 a bill that banned conversion therapy, right? But there are still states that allow things like conversion therapy. It's a problem. Now, as a therapist, as a counselor, you also need to examine your own biases related to sexual orientation, related to heterosexism and homophobia. Now, heterosexism is different than homophobia. When we talk about heterosexism, that is just a bias of the assumption that everybody is heterosexual or should be heterosexual. Now, people don't say that overtly, but heterosexism might occur in the following way. When did you realize that you were gay? You might ask one of your male friends that. But if you ask your male friend that, believe it or not, that is an example of heterosexism. How so? You're probably like, oh, come on, I can't even ask my friend a question like, when did they realize they're gay? Or when did a person realize that they're a lesbian? The answer is no, you can't. And the reason is because you don't ask your straight friends, when did they realize that they were heterosexual? And because you don't ask your heterosexual friends that question, it implies a bias that of some novelty around being gay, lesbian, bisexual, or so forth. Now, some people might say, oh, it's curiosity, but why aren't you curious about your heterosexual friends the same way? Now, heterosexism is a problem in its own right, but homophobia is a whole nother level, right? Heterosexism could be an implicit bias. Homophobia results in a whole host of harmful outcomes. So saying things like, my kid's gym teacher, male gym teacher, is gay, so I don't want him to be my kid's gym teacher. Why? The assumption is that because he's male and your son is male, that somehow he's going to have an attraction to your son, which is absurdity. It's actually absurd on two fronts, because it increases the assumption of gay males are pedophiles, which is not true. The profile of the number one example of a pedophile is actually a heterosexual male. That's the number one perpetrator. So a gay male gym teacher is not going to target your son, right? So that's absurdity in of its own right. And then also the assumption that just because a person is gay, right, they're going to have an attraction to your son. Well, if a person is heterosexual, they're not attracted to everyone they walk by. So why would your son's male gym teacher have an attraction to your son? That's homophobia. Or saying, I don't want lesbians to adopt kids or have kids through in vitro because their kid's going to either be gay or lesbian. That's absurdity, right? We have research to suggest that there's no increase from generation to generation that's affected by whether you have same-sex parents or parents of differing sexes. So these are examples of the research is clear, but people have their biases. So if you had any of those biases, whether it be heterosexism, homophobia, you want to check it. You want to get some guidance. Now, when working with sexual orientation, you should establish norms that create safety and inclusion for members of the LGBTQ community. That could include something as simple as asking a person what their preferred pronoun is. Because if you don't ask a person what their preferred pronoun is, and you don't call them by their preferred name, you run the risk of calling someone him or her, creating a binary status, which could trample on a member of the trans community. So asking preferred pronouns, how do you identify, could be very, very important. Also knowing your limitations. So if you are a heterosexual, cisgender clinician, and you don't know everything, be curious, ask questions, allow members of the LGBT community to be the leader. In fact, if I was going to self-critique, I actually used one word on this lecture that I wish I could have modified. I used the word straight. The word is heterosexual, right? So there is an implicit bias in that word straight. I didn't mean anything by it, but if I were in a group setting, working with LGBTQ members, I would hope that someone would call me out on that and say, hey, we tend to use the term heterosexual, homosexual, and so forth. We don't use straight, right? That's no longer a terminology we use, right? So you want to invite people to challenge you. You want to invite people to voluntarily self-identify, self-disclose. Don't make any assumptions. Don't be overly oppressive or covertly disrespectful to members of the LGBT community. All of these are basic basic rules. All right, now in terms of group techniques, you'll notice that because in your class, your students, I tend to jump in. I tend to apply certain techniques in a classroom. If you're not familiar with the technique, you want to try and avoid using it because it could be unethical without proper supervision to employ a technique that you're not trained in. So if you're using unfamiliar techniques without supervision, if you're using techniques to increase your power or create drama among members of the group or intensity or to be coercive or oppressive, that's not going to be okay, right? Now, if you're using your techniques to change a person's value system, that's not okay, right? There are some times in group where people are like, well, what's the right answer? And we've answered consistently, there is no objectively right answer. It is what it is. Just be. Whatever your answer is, that's the correct answer for you based on your experience. So that phenomenological or subjective reality is important. Now, you want to get proper training. So if you're going to run group therapy, you must make sure that you have proper training. And if you are saying you're competent in it, you must market yourself appropriately. I'll tell you in all fairness, I am not board certified in group therapy. I am properly trained in group therapy, but I am not a board certified or credentialed group therapist. What does that mean? That means that if I were to say I was credentialed as a board by the board of group therapy, then I would have a problem. Now, I was trained in my practicum, internship, postdoc in group therapy. So I'm competent, but you don't overstate your qualifications. You must understand that competence is the number one thing. Don't do anything that goes beyond your limitations. If you don't know it, say you don't know it. Seek guidance. Now, best practices according to so the American Society for Group Work, these are best practices. So understand what competence means. Competence is on a continuum. You're continuously trying to become more and more competent, but no one is ever fully competent. It is an ongoing basis. So you should always continue to learn and develop new skills. And when you stop, that's when problems emerge. In life, it's as if you're walking up an escalator going down. So whenever you stop moving, you regress, you go backwards. The field may leave you. So you have to continuously work at your craft to stay competent. So continuing education, professional development activities are absolutely essential for you maintaining your competence. For example, New York State, in actually this year, 2021, enacted continuing education credits for psychologists. The law passed in 2019, but now it's required that psychologists get every 3 years 36 credits of professional development in order to make sure that they stay prepared for the field. If you have any problems that can impair your ability to lead a group, recognize that. Seek consultation, seek supervision. Now, I keep using the word consultation supervision, but I'm not sure I defined it. Consultation is sort of like, hey, I'm having this problem. What do you think? It's a one-off thing, typically. You seek advice. Supervision is an ongoing oversight of your actions. Now, so there are different competencies that you have as a group leader. So you need to have knowledge competencies. So that's basically the coursework and training. You need to have skill competencies, learning how to lead a group, right? That's skill-based. Now, by the way, this class will provide you knowledge competencies based on the lecture and skill competencies based on leading a group and being able to intervene. But getting core specialization, that's an ongoing basis. I could not run every possible group under the sun. I've led anger management group, I've led substance abuse groups, I've led identity groups, I've led a whole bunch of groups, but there are many groups that if I was asked to lead, I would say I need to get further training on that. Now, experiential group training, what are some of the benefits? Well, I could lecture at you and talk about some of these processes, or you can experience it and start to feel some of the things people feel. By the way, I engaged in confrontation strategically today, right? So I was like, I'm disappointed. There appears to be some resistance. People don't want to hear that you're disappointed. People don't want to hear that there's resistance, but I wanted to model authenticity and confrontation, right? So, but in any event, the experiential group that you have allows you to learn through experience, but you have to be able to trust your instructor, whether it be me or anyone else. You have to be able to believe that the person is ethical and they're professional. All of these are absolutely important for you to benefit from an experiential group. It gives you opportunity to dissect yourself a little bit more finely, look at yourself, develop insight. And it gives you the opportunity to see what it's like on the other side. When you're leading the groups, now you know what it feels like to be a member of a group, struggling through conflict, communicating with other members of the group, increasing your interpersonal functioning. All of that you're seeing on one side, but you'll now know what your clients are experiencing. So some basic legal safeguards for group practice. Take the time and screen candidates for appropriateness, demystify the process, explain what they're going to have, try to be collaborative as much with members as possible. You'll notice I say when I'm leading a group or I'm part of a group, I'm Dan. I don't see myself as an authority in that, just as a co-facilitator. Seek guidance from supervisor and colleagues if there's an ethical or legal concern. Apply ethical standards into your work and so forth. So that, in a nutshell, is our lecture. And I went on and on and on, but I'm going to stop there.